last class we had discussed about the various rights and duties of the buyer against the seller. So this class will be discussing about the seller, that is the unpaid seller. Now who is an unpaid seller? A seller is called unpaid seller when the full price has not been paid or a bill of exchange has been given as conditional payment if it has been dishonored. So we understand that if it's on cash basis, that is the contract is on cash basis, then if the seller has not received the payment, he is called as unpaid seller. The second circumstance is when the sale is happening on what? Not cash basis but credit basis. So you take the goods now but you promise to pay after 3 months. What is the guarantee? That we have a bill of exchange as the legal document there. So when that bill of exchange is being produced in the bank, if the bill gets dishonored, then in such case the seller is called unpaid seller. Two circumstances: either on cash basis, cash is not received, is called as unpaid seller; either on credit basis, bill of exchange gets dishonored, it becomes unpaid seller. Hope you understand what is bill of exchange, correct? We already have discussed that. So these are the two conditions under which he is called as unpaid sellers. So what are the rights of unpaid sellers? So there are two different rights. One is rights against the goods and the other one is rights against the buyer. Rights against goods are right to possession or lien, right of stoppage of goods in transit, right of resale. Under rights against the buyer, we have suit for price, suit for interest and special damages, suit for damages for non-acceptance, suit for breach of contract. So let's discuss this in detail. The first part was against the goods. The first thing says a right of possession or lien. So in general, what do you mean by lien? Lien or possession is the right to retain the goods. Right to retain the goods. So keep the goods with seller himself until and unless the buyer pays the price. So if the buyer fails to pay the price within the decided time, that is mutually agreed upon by seller and the buyer, then unpaid seller has the right to keep the goods in possession. So he does not have to deliver the goods, but he can keep the goods until and unless the buyer pays the full price of the goods. When can the lien right be lost? One, when already in the carrier the seller has sent in the truck or any kind of vehicle, the goods have been sent to the buyer, he loses that right because the goods are no more with the seller in possession. Second circumstances, when the buyer gets the possession of goods. He gets to lose the right of lien, one, when he sends the goods in the carrier or the truck, or otherwise when the buyer has got the possession of the goods, then he cannot exercise this right of possession or lien. Second, when the right of possession can be exercised. So we got to know when it can't be exercised. Let's see when it can be exercised. When goods are sold on cash basis but payment is unpaid. That means the goods are still remaining with the seller. That's when he can exercise. Second, when goods have been sold on credit basis and the term of credit has expired. So when the term of credit has expired, he can retain back the goods and that's when he can exercise the right of possession. Then when the buyer becomes insolvent even within the decided period for payment. So insolvent is that he does not have any bank balance left to make the payment to seller. Once the seller understands that buyer is insolvent and he cannot pay back the money, he can take back the goods into his possession. Is that clear? So that's the first right of the seller, right of lien or possession. The second right that he has is the right of stoppage of goods in transit. If the buyer fails to pay the price within the decided time, then unpaid seller has the right to stop the goods in transit. Goods in transit means what? That already goods have been shipped or already goods have been moving from from the seller's location to the buyer's location. That in between transit or goods in transport is called as stoppage of goods in transit. So when can this right be exercised? The conditions are when the seller is unpaid either wholly or partly, when the buyer becomes insolvent. So here the first condition is when the seller is unpaid wholly. Either the seller has not received the full price or the seller has received only the part of the price. If the whole price of the contract is rupees 10,000, he has only received 4,000 rupees. So the remaining balance is still unpaid. Therefore, goods in transit right can be exercised. Second, when the buyer becomes insolvent, as we just discussed, if the buyer does not have any kind of bank balance to repay, then right away when the goods are being transported or shipped, he can order his agent or inform or communicate to his agent, do not ship the goods to that particular address, but then stop it right there and bring it back. Third condition, goods must be in the course of transit. This means that goods must not be in possession of the seller and have not reached the buyer's possession as well. So here, where are the goods? Who does the goods? It's in whose possession? Is it in seller's possession? No, the goods are in transit. That means the goods are traveling. Has it reached the buyer yet? No, it is neither with the seller, neither with the buyer, but the goods are in transit. So this is the only time where the seller can exercise the right to stoppage of goods in transit. He can stop the goods in reaching the buyer and he can turn the goods again back to himself. The third right, right of resale. The unpaid seller has the right to resell the goods. Why? Because he is being unpaid, right? He is not getting the payment of the goods. So he definitely has the right to resell. Let's look at the conditions for resale. Number one, if the goods are perishable in nature. For example, all the vegetation goods, right, that has been in the farm, right, all the kinds of fruits and vegetables, because if these are not consumed immediately or within a very short span of time, they get to perish and nobody is benefited, nobody can make profit by selling it when it's perished. Yes or no? So therefore, when it is perishable nature, can resell them immediately without the notice of the buyer. So buyer must be aware that the goods are perishable. I need to make an immediate payment, so the goods are immediately shipped to me. If the buyer is not willing to make the payment, that is understood by the seller, so seller automatically, without telling the buyer, he can resell the goods to another buyer. In case it is a non-perishable goods, then the seller must communicate to the buyer that if you are not paying me, I will resell the goods. Okay, so send a notice to the buyer and then resell them. In case by reselling to the second buyer, if the seller is enjoying profit, he can retain that profit. But if the seller is incurring loss because he sold it after certain time period, if he is incurring loss or the damages, that damage or loss seller can claim from the original buyer, that is the first buyer who did not pay him the complete price of the sale. Is that clear? So three different rights against the goods we studied: right in possession, right to stoppage in the goods of transit, and right for resale. These are the three rights against the goods for the unpaid seller. Let's look at the rights against buyer. First thing is suit for price. So whatever the price of the contract was, 10,000 or 50,000, whatever the price of the goods contract was, he can sue the buyer for the entire price of the contract or agreement. Second, sue for interest and special damages. Now here the suit can be filed for interest and special damages, where interest will be paid on the amount of deal between seller and buyer on the notice or discretion of the court. If you remember, when we are studying about the rights of buyer, okay, there the buyer could charge interest in case he has made prior payment to the seller and seller has not delivered the goods on time. Buyer could also charge him or sue him for the interest. We studied accordingly, correct? Same thing, the seller can charge interest on whatever the price of the contract is. Based on that price, he can again charge an extra interest based on what? Discretion of the court. That means the court also has to support that yes, you can charge interest on the buyer because he has made to fail the payment. Is that clear? So that's the second point, sue for interest and special damages. Number 3, sue for damages for non-acceptance. In case the seller has sent the goods, okay, and the buyer has not accepted the goods, okay. The goods are not that it is not outside the agreement. As per mutually agreed, the quality, the quantity, the features, price, everything is as per agreement. But then the buyer wrongfully refuses to accept the goods. Then the seller can sue for the damages for non-acceptance. The final one, sue for breach of contract, because he is not able to make the contract complete or make the contract fulfilled. The obligations are not being able to fulfill because the seller was ready to complete the contract or fulfill his promise, but the buyer was not ready to fulfill his promise. So in that case, the seller can sue for the breach of contract because he cancelled the contract unnecessarily. Is that clear? So these are the 4 conditions or 4 rights for the unpaid seller against the buyer. Against the seller we have 3 points, and against the buyer 4 points. Sue for price, interest and special damages, sue for damages for non-acceptance, and sue for breach of contract.